It always starts the same way. A clipboard, a smug smile, and a false sense of power. That's exactly how Nancy Grant, our HOA president, strutted around the neighborhood. To most of my neighbors, she was just a nuisance, someone who nitpicked over lawn heights and mailbox paint. But to me, I saw something different. I saw a woman obsessed with control, desperate to turn a homeowners association into her own little dictatorship. Nancy loved to parade around like she was running a government agency. She'd stop in front of houses with her pen clicking, scribbling on her clipboard like she was issuing citations. She'd wag papers in the air, ordinance notices, she called them, slapping them on doors and mailboxes with the confidence of a sheriff nailing a wanted poster. But these weren't real laws. They were pieces of paper drafted by a board of neighbors who thought rules about driveway stains and trash cans somehow made them lawmakers. One afternoon, I caught her standing in front of my house, waving a bright yellow slip at my truck. She smiled like she had just caught a criminal in the act. "Violation notice," she announced, her voice sharp and theatrical. "You can't park your truck here overnight. HOA Ordinance, Section 12. I looked at her, then at my truck, which sat legally in my own driveway. Registered. Inspected. Perfectly in line with State Vehicle Code 22507.2. That code clearly states HOAs cannot override municipal parking laws. But Nancy didn't care about the law. She cared about her illusion of power. I kept my voice calm. "Nancy, my truck is legally parked. You can't cite me for this. HOAs don't override state codes." Her smirk widened. "Then you can explain that to the board. Until then, you owe a $150 fine." She scribbled my name onto her paper like she had already won. That was the first spark, the moment I realized this wasn't just neighborhood pettiness. Nancy wasn't satisfied with enforcing landscaping rules. She wanted to control everything, down to where I parked on my own property. At first, I thought maybe ignoring her would make the nonsense die down. But with Nancy, ignoring her was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Every time I tossed her bogus letters in the shredder, she came back twice as aggressive. She'd strut through the neighborhood telling other residents, "We have a non-compliant homeowner. We're considering stronger action." Stronger action? For parking? It was laughable, but some neighbors bought into her act. People started whispering. Some even avoided me, afraid they'd be targeted next. The thing is, Nancy didn't know who she was dealing with. I wasn't just another homeowner. I wasn't someone she could scare with empty threats. I was the chief of police for the entire county. And while I never flaunted that role around the neighborhood, I wasn't about to let someone weaponize fake authority against me or anyone else. But Nancy pushed harder. Within a week, the violation notices turned into formal warnings. She printed them with an HOA letterhead, stamped them like they were legal summons. Each one carried bigger threats, fines, liens, even the possibility of legal enforcement. Legal enforcement? That phrase made me pause. She was no longer just bluffing about money. She was hinting at force, at compliance through intimidation. And intimidation has a funny way of revealing someone's true nature. One evening, as I took out the trash, Nancy marched up with her clipboard tucked under her arm. "This is your final warning," she declared, waving yet another paper in my face. "Failure to comply will result in enforcement action." I leaned on my trash bin, staring at her. "Enforcement by who, Nancy? You? The HOA? Because the last time I checked, only sworn officers can enforce the law. And that isn't you." Her smile faltered just a little, but she quickly recovered. "You'll see. We have ways." She turned and stormed off, her heels clacking on the pavement like a gavel striking wood. That was the moment I knew something bigger was coming. Nancy wasn't just bluffing with paper fines anymore. She was preparing to escalate. And while my neighbors thought this was just HOA drama, I could already feel the storm gathering. Because when someone builds their whole identity on fake power, they don't back down. They double down. And Nancy? She was about to double down in a way that would change everything. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the whole street seems to slow down. Porch lights flickered on one by one, and the hum of sprinklers echoed through the cul-de-sac. I was sitting at my kitchen table, paperwork spread out, sipping coffee, when I heard 3 sharp knocks on my front door. Not the casual tap of a neighbor stopping by, but the deliberate bang 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 of someone trying to establish authority. I stood up slowly, instinct already kicking in. Something about the rhythm of those knocks told me this wasn't just a friendly visit. When I opened the door, 2 men stood there. Not in uniforms, not in suits, but in pressed polo shirts tucked into khaki pants. Each wore a lanyard around their neck, with laminated badges swinging against their chests. At first glance, it might have fooled an elderly neighbor or a nervous homeowner. But I'd worn a real badge for most of my adult life. These things? They looked like they'd been printed at Office Depot. The taller one stepped forward, puffing his chest like he'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror. "Good evening, sir," he said, voice low and official sounding. "We're with the HOA Compliance Division. We need to discuss your continued violations." I almost laughed at the phrase, HOA Compliance Division. It sounded like a knockoff of a government agency, like something out of a bad TV drama. I raised an eyebrow. Compliance Division? Never heard of it. The second man, stockier and more aggressive, held up his fake badge and tilted his chin high. "We've been authorized to enforce HOA codes. You're in violation for parking an oversized vehicle in your driveway. That's against regulations." I kept my expression neutral, even though inside, alarm bells were ringing. "And if I refuse to pay your fine?" I asked. The stocky one leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Then we'll have no choice but to escalate. Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to arrest you for non-compliance with HOA code." There it was, the word that changed everything. Arrest. Now, here's the truth, HOAs don't have arrest powers. They can't detain anyone. They're not law enforcement. The only people who can arrest under State Penal Code 830.1 are sworn peace officers. These guys weren't just bluffing, they were impersonating officers, and that's a felony under Title 18, U.S. Code 912. But I didn't show my hand. Not yet. Instead, I tilted my head, acting confused, and let them keep talking. "Arrest me? For parking in my own driveway?" The tall one nodded solemnly. "That's correct. Unless you settle your violations immediately, we'll have to file charges. Our authority comes directly from the HOA board." I forced myself not to smirk. Everything they said, every fake claim, was stacking up as evidence. My body camera, clipped discreetly under my shirt, captured every word. I wanted them to bury themselves deeper. So I asked questions, pretending to take their threats seriously. "What kind of charges? What's the maximum penalty? How does this process work?" They answered like actors who'd studied a bad script. "We'll process you at the HOA security office," one said. "You'll be booked, fined, and possibly barred from community amenities." Booked? HOA amenities? The absurdity almost made me laugh out loud. But I kept my face straight, nodding like I was intimidated. After 10 minutes of bluster and empty threats, they left a letter on my porch, an official compliance order with HOA logos slapped across the top. The signatures at the bottom were scrawled in Sharpie, no titles, no notary stamps. As they walked back down my driveway, I stood silently in the doorway, watching their silhouettes disappear into the night. My hands clenched. Not from fear, but from resolve. Because this wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was criminal impersonation. This was trespassing. This was a direct attempt to intimidate me with fabricated authority. And the irony? They had no idea who they'd just threatened. I closed the door and set the letter on my table, snapping a photo with my phone to preserve the evidence. My mind was already racing ahead. What were their next moves? How far was Nancy willing to take this charade? I had a feeling I wouldn't have to wait long to find out. People who bluff this hard don't stop after one knock. They push further. They escalate. I leaned back in my chair, sipping the last of my coffee, and whispered to myself, if they want to play cops, they're about to meet the real thing. The game had begun. 2 days passed after that first encounter. I thought maybe the bluff had collapsed, that Nancy and her band of pretend enforcers had realized they'd gone too far. But deep down, I knew better. Bullies don't retreat when they feel powerful, they double down. It was late Saturday afternoon when I heard it again, the same heavy knock, only this time louder, sharper, more urgent. My pulse quickened as I walked toward the door. I already had my body camera charged and ready, tucked under my shirt. My phone was on the counter, recording too. If they came back, I was going to catch every second. When I opened the door, the scene outside almost made me laugh. A white SUV sat in my driveway. Not a police cruiser, but someone had tried their best to make it look like one. Flashing amber lights on the roof, security stenciled on the side in block letters, and a cheap spotlight duct taped near the mirror. It looked like a toy car someone had dressed up for Halloween. And standing beside it? The same 2 men from before, plus a third. The new guy was taller, wearing aviator sunglasses even though the sun was setting. His belt had zip ties looped through it like makeshift handcuffs. He stood with his hands on his hips, projecting that fake confidence only imposters have. The stocky one stepped forward first, holding out another laminated card. "Sir," he barked, "you've ignored a lawful compliance order. We are here to enforce it. You are now officially under HOA arrest." HOA arrest. The phrase was so absurd, I nearly lost composure. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. HOA arrest? That's a new one. Did you guys just invent a penal code overnight? The tall man with the sunglasses spoke up, voice deep and theatrical. "Don't get smart. We have authorization to detain you. Step outside and place your hands behind your back." He tapped the zip ties on his belt like they were handcuffs from an evidence locker. Inside, I felt a wave of anger roll through me, not because I was afraid, but because I was watching a crime unfold on my own doorstep. These men weren't just harassing me anymore. They were attempting unlawful detention, impersonation, and intimidation. And they thought they could get away with it because most people wouldn't know better. But they had chosen the wrong house. Still, I stayed calm, pretending to weigh their words. "So let me get this straight. You want me to step outside so you can arrest me, with zip ties? And then what? Drive me to the clubhouse in your knockoff patrol car?" The stocky one scowled. "You think this is a joke? You're obstructing compliance enforcement. That's an additional violation." I tilted my head, my voice dropping cold. "Obstructing what, exactly? Show me your statute. Show me the law. Because I've never read about HOA officers having powers of arrest in the California Penal Code. Maybe you can educate me." They froze. That was the first crack in their armor. The tall one cleared his throat, stammering. It falls under community bylaws. Section 14B. I almost smiled. Community bylaws don't override state law. And impersonating a peace officer? That carries up to 3 years in prison. Did you know that? Now they shifted uncomfortably, their fake authority unraveling. But instead of backing down, the stocky one reached for his zip ties. "Enough talk. Step outside now." I straightened, my voice sharp as steel. "Touch me, and you'll be in handcuffs for real. And trust me, you won't like where I take you." For the first time, hesitation flickered in their eyes. They didn't know who I was. Not yet. They thought I was just another homeowner they could scare. I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a calm, almost dangerous tone. "Do yourselves a favor. Leave my property. Tonight. Because if you step 1 foot closer, I won't be the one in trouble, you will." The silence stretched for a few seconds. Finally, the tall one muttered, "We'll be back." This isn't over. They climbed into their fake patrol SUV, amber lights flashing as they rolled down the street. I stood in my doorway, fists clenched. They thought this was a game. But soon, they were going to learn exactly who they were dealing with. And the next time they came back, I wouldn't just be waiting, I'd be ready to strike. They came back faster than I expected, like men who convinced themselves they were untouchable. This time, the air felt charged, neighbors peeking through curtains, a kid pausing on his bike, the distant bark of a dog. I had my body camera live and my phone rolling. I wanted every second preserved, uncut, unspun. When the third man stepped out of that fake patrol SUV, he moved like someone who'd rehearsed intimidation in front of a mirror, zip ties glinting on his belt, sunglasses on even as dusk crept in. The stocky one jabbed a finger in my direction. "You've been non-compliant long enough. Place your hands behind your back and come with us." I kept my hands where they were, visible, empty, not a threat. But I didn't comply. Not because I was cocky, but because I knew their act for what it was, criminal impersonation and an attempted unlawful detention. And there was no way I was going to let them drag me, or anyone, into that circus. "Step 1, show me your credentials," I said. "Step 2, state your authority to detain a private citizen on private property." They fumbled. The tall one fumbled for words, then blurted, "We have board authorization." The stocky guy's hand drifted toward his zip ties. That was my cue. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I had a duty, to myself, to the neighbors, and to the integrity of the badge I'd sworn to uphold. I moved the way I'd trained for a lifetime, fast, efficient, and decisive. I stepped forward, grabbed the nearest arm, and twisted. The stocky man tried to yank free, his balance betrayed him. One sharp move, and he hit the pavement, clutching his wrist with a sound that made the kids behind the blinds gasp. The third man lunged with a wild, clumsy swing, zip-tie high, like he had no idea what he was really doing. I used his momentum, hooked the ankle, swept the leg, and down he went, face first onto the driveway. He yelped, the air knocked from him. I wasn't looking to injure maliciously, I was aiming to disable the attempt to kidnap, to stop an unlawful detention before it became something worse. When they moved, joints popped and cries cut the evening air. Neighbors' heads snapped out of windows. A woman gasped. For a moment, everything slowed. Two imposters on the ground, vulnerable, their tough guy bravado dissolved into raw, human fear. I didn't make a show of it. I crouched, kept control, and spoke with a calmness that felt colder than the night. "Don't move. Put your hands where I can see them." Then I did what I never wanted to do publicly, I produced my county badge. Not the laminated parody they've been flashing, but the real, hard metal badge that represents authority, legality, and the oath I'd taken. I set it on the hood of their fake patrol SUV so anyone watching could see what real authority looked like. "You boys just impersonated sworn officers, attempted an unlawful detention, and trespassed," I said, voice steady. "That's federal and state-level criminal conduct. You're done tonight." Their faces shifted from bravado to white-knuckle panic. The stocky one whimpered. The tall one stammered, "We were told to." "Who told you?" I asked, dialing dispatch. I gave the operator a calm, precise summary, location, suspects, crimes in progress, requesting immediate backup. I read them the men their rights aloud, not because they were under arrest yet, but to start the process and make everything crystal clear on the record. Every second I took to document and speak was building a chain that no defense attorney would like. Within minutes, because this is a small county and we respond fast, real squad cars rounded the corner. Lights painted the street blue and red, the real weight of law enforcement arrived. My officers exited with guns holstered but hands ready. They moved with practiced coordination, secured the men, and began standard procedure, handcuffs, Miranda, search, and transport. Neighbors emerged, some shaking, others whispering, mouths forming the single word circulating down the block, "Chief." Somebody snapped a photo, someone else murmured, "Is he really the chief of police?" I watched my team do their jobs, evidence bagging, photographing the fake badges, logging statements. The imposters were quiet now, faces hollowed, the bravado gone. Their stun had evaporated in the presence of real authority. Later, while officers transported the suspects, residents came up to me, soft, uncertain thank yous, a few questions about how this could even happen. Their eyes said what words didn't: relief, astonishment, and the dawning understanding that what they'd assumed was petty HOA drama had nearly become criminal harm. I stood on my porch as the last squad car drove away, lights fading into the night. My badge felt heavy in my pocket, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The price of authority is responsibility, to act when the line is crossed, and to ensure justice is done properly, transparently, and with restraint. Tonight, the line had been crossed. And tonight, the law had answered. But the story was far from over. The hits, the questions, and the fallout were all on the horizon. At the station, the performance was over. No fake patrol car, no sunglasses, no cheap laminated badges. Just two men limping, shackled, and suddenly very aware that they weren't in charge anymore. They were booked like any other suspects, fingerprints, mugshots, personal property logged. But their swagger had evaporated, replaced with a hollow-eyed panic that comes only when people realize they've stepped into crimes far bigger than they imagined. I stood behind the glass of the observation room as detectives began their questioning. I didn't need to be in the room, my officers were more than capable. Still, this case was personal, and I wanted to hear every word. The stocky one broke first. It didn't take much, just a reminder of the charges they were facing: impersonating a peace officer, attempted unlawful detention, criminal trespassing, conspiracy. Add them up, and they were staring at years behind bars. His legs still stiff from where I disabled him, he shifted uncomfortably in the chair, sweating under the fluorescent lights. "I didn't want to do it," he muttered, voice cracking. "She said it'd be easy. Just scare him a little." "She," the detective pressed. "Who are we talking about?" He licked his lips, glanced at the mirror, knowing I was there. Then he whispered the name I already expected. "Nancy. Nancy Grant. The HOA president." I leaned forward in my chair, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. This wasn't just rogue neighbors acting tough. This was a directed campaign. Someone with influence had put these men up to it. The tall one tried to resist longer, keeping his lips pressed shut, arms crossed tight. But when the detective slid evidence across the table, the fake badges, the body cam footage, and a neighbor's video of their staged arrest, his face fell. He slumped in the chair like the weight of reality had finally hit him. "She said you were a problem," he admitted. "She said you thought you were above the rules, and that we needed to teach you a lesson. She promised us cash, $5,000 each. She said nobody would call the cops because everyone's scared of her." The detective leaned back, his voice steady. "Except the man you tried to arrest is the cops. Chief of police, to be exact." The man blinked, stunned. I could almost see the gears locking in his brain, the realization that Nancy hadn't just set them up for failure, she'd set them up to crash into a wall they couldn't climb over. By the time questioning wrapped, the file was airtight. Statements, evidence, and confessions all pointed in one direction: Nancy Grant. She wasn't just guilty of overreach or intimidation. She was orchestrating a conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, weaponize fear, and retaliate against me for doing my job months earlier when her son had been cited for reckless driving. When officers brought her in, she still had that air of superiority, chin high, eyes cold. She called it a misunderstanding, a community dispute blown out of proportion. But when I slid the folder across the table, complete with her recruit's signed statements and video evidence, her mask cracked. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I told her, my voice calm but unyielding. "This is a criminal conspiracy. And you're at the center of it." Her lawyer tried to object, but the facts were immovable. Nancy wasn't going to bluff her way out this time. Within hours, she was processed like the rest, mugshot, fingerprints, the works. No special treatment. The woman who once strutted through our neighborhood with a clipboard like she owned it was now reduced to another inmate in County Orange. Word spread fast. By morning, the HOA board had convened an emergency meeting. Neighbors who'd been afraid of Nancy's iron grip finally had proof of what I'd long known: her authority was a facade built on fear. And when fear collapsed, all that remained was accountability. As I drove home that night, sirens fading behind me, the neighborhood felt different. Windows glowed warmly. Families lingered on porches instead of hiding behind blinds. For the first time in years, people felt safe enough to breathe. I wasn't just their neighbor anymore. I was the one who had torn down the curtain of false authority. And soon, Nancy and her enforcers would learn that in our county, the law isn't a suggestion, it's a line carved in stone. And they had crossed it. The morning after Nancy's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed like a hornet's nest. Word had traveled faster than the sirens from the night before. People whispered on sidewalks, text chains lit up, and by noon an emergency HOA meeting was announced. It wasn't voluntary. The bylaws Nancy herself had written stated that if the president faced felony charges, the board was obligated to meet within 24 hours. Ironically, the rules she'd weaponized were now the very rope tightening around her. The clubhouse, normally a sterile room where Nancy lorded over residents with her clipboard and smug smile, was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, neighbors shifted uncomfortably, and the air was thick with a mix of curiosity and long-suppressed resentment. I walked in quietly, not in uniform, not flashing my badge, just as a homeowner. Heads turned, whispers followed me, but I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The evidence already spoke louder than anything I could say. At the front of the room sat the remaining board members, faces pale, lips pressed tight. Nancy's chair was empty, a glaring reminder of the scandal now gripping our community. One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Collins, cleared his throat. As you all know, our president, Ms. Grant, has been detained. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't make things worse. We have to discuss next steps. The room erupted. She sent fake cops to my neighbor's house, one woman shouted. She threatened to fine me last year for planting a rose bush, another yelled. She told my son he couldn't park his bike on the porch. The anger wasn't new. It had been building for years: Nancy's petty rules, her power trips, her smug belief that she controlled us. But now the dam had broken. The fear was gone, replaced by outrage. Collins banged a gavel against the table. Order! Please, order! A man stood from the back, voice steady but firm. There's no order left. Not while she's in charge. We demand a vote to remove Nancy Grant permanently. The crowd roared in agreement. Procedurally, the board had to allow it. And so, one by one, neighbors raised their hands. The vote was swift, unanimous. Not a single person spoke in her defense. Nancy, who had once commanded this room with iron authority, had been erased in less than 10 minutes. But the board didn't stop there. They passed motions stripping her of any financial influence, fining her for legal costs, and banning her from ever holding office in the HOA again. For a woman who thrived on control, this wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. As the meeting closed, Collins looked directly at me. Chief, we owe you more than we can say. You didn't just protect yourself. You protected all of us. I shook my head. I didn't do this as your chief of police. I did it as your neighbor. But make no mistake, what Nancy did wasn't just wrong. It was criminal. And she'll answer for it in court. When I left the clubhouse, the atmosphere was transformed. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were standing tall, shaking hands, even smiling. Kids rode bikes without being scolded. Couples spoke openly instead of whispering in fear of Nancy's clipboard. That night, I sat on my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, squad cars still parked down the street as a precaution. The neighborhood was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. Peaceful. Free. Nancy had thought she could bend the law with fear and fake authority. But she forgot the most important truth: the law doesn't serve egos, it serves justice. And justice had found her. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. A trial was coming, and her conspirators would face their own sentences. But for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid. They were awake. And they knew, finally, that no one, not even Nancy Grant, was above the law. The trial moved faster than anyone expected. With the evidence airtight, body cam footage, fake badges, sworn statements, the prosecutor didn't need to work hard to build a case. Nancy Grant wasn't just facing local charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office picked it up because impersonating an officer is a federal crime. That alone carries serious weight. The two men who tried to arrest me pled guilty almost immediately. Their knees were still wrapped in braces when they stood before the judge. They looked smaller than they had on my driveway, deflated, pitiful. Both were sentenced to time in federal prison, plus fines they'd be paying off long after they got out. Their dreams of easy money had turned into years behind bars. Nancy, though, was different. She fought. She hired expensive lawyers, tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. She claimed she was simply trying to protect community standards. But every time she spoke, the evidence cut her words to ribbons. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy, impersonation, attempted unlawful detention. The judge's gavel fell heavy as he sentenced her to multiple years in prison. No special treatment, no community service loopholes. Prison. When the verdict was read, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Neighbors who'd come to watch sat in stunned silence. Some shook their heads, others smiled faintly, as though a weight they'd carried for years had finally lifted. Nancy, for the first time, didn't smirk. She just stared straight ahead, her power gone. Back in the neighborhood, life shifted almost overnight. The HOA board, stripped of Nancy's influence, rewrote the bylaws to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. Fines became fair. Rules became reasonable. Meetings became civil discussions instead of battlegrounds. I noticed it most in the small things. Kids rode their bikes on sidewalks without anyone snapping pictures or threatening fines. A neighbor parked his truck in his own driveway without sticky notes appearing on the windshield. Families gathered in their front yards, talking openly, without fear of retaliation. It was as if a long, suffocating shadow had finally lifted. One evening, about a month after the sentencing, the board invited me to speak at a community gathering. They called it a fresh start. I stood at the front, not as their chief of police, but as their neighbor. The clubhouse was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was light, hopeful. Justice isn't always loud, I told them. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it's heavy. And sometimes, it requires us to stand up when no one else will. What happened here wasn't about an HOA. It wasn't about rules or fines. It was about fear. And fear only wins when we let it. You all stood up. You voted. You took your community back. That's real power. That's real justice. The applause wasn't thunderous, it was steady, heartfelt. People weren't clapping for me. They were clapping for themselves, for what they had overcome together. Later, as I walked home under the streetlights, I thought about Nancy and the two men who had tried to arrest me. I didn't feel satisfaction. Not really. Justice isn't about satisfaction, it's about balance. About making sure the line between right and wrong stays clear. On my porch, coffee in hand, I looked out at the quiet street. Lawns were tidy, porches alive with conversation, laughter drifting on the breeze. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like what it was supposed to be, a community, not a kingdom ruled by fear. Nancy had thought she could weaponize fake power. She thought she could bend the law with intimidation. But she learned the hard way: when you cross the line into real crimes, the law answers back. And this time, the law lived right next door. That's how the HOA learned the lesson they'll never forget. When you send fake officers after the chief of police, you don't just lose your power. You lose everything. Months passed, but the echoes of what happened still lingered in the neighborhood. Some scars heal fast, others slower, but the most important thing was clear: people were no longer afraid. The trial had ended. Nancy was behind bars, her name disgraced, her once commanding presence now reduced to a cautionary tale. The two imposters she hired were serving their sentences too, limping into prison with knees that would never quite work the same again. Their faces had been splashed across local news, a reminder of what happens when you impersonate the law. But it wasn't the punishment that stuck with people most, it was the freedom afterward. For years, Nancy had ruled like a dictator with a clipboard, her so-called compliance checks nothing more than intimidation wrapped in bureaucracy. But now, the air was lighter. The HOA meetings were no longer battlegrounds. Neighbors laughed together, argued constructively, and solved problems like adults instead of subjects bowing to a queen. I could see it on the faces of the families who had once cowered. The elderly couple across the street, who had once been threatened with fines for a flagpole on their lawn, now proudly raised the flag every morning. The single mom who had been bullied for leaving her garbage bins out too long could now greet her neighbors without shame. Even the kids felt it, they roamed freely, chalk on sidewalks, basketballs bouncing in driveways, no longer worried about the sound of Nancy's heels clicking down the block. The neighborhood had taken its first breath of real independence. For me, though, the lesson went deeper. When Nancy first tried to weaponize her authority, I could have dismissed it as a petty annoyance. I could have paid the bogus fine, ignored the threats, gone about my life. But that's how abuse grows, when good people let small injustices slide. Petty power, if unchecked, festers into something dangerous. I realized something important through all this: power without accountability is poison. Whether it's an HOA president with a clipboard or a con artist flashing a fake badge, unchecked authority destroys trust, corrodes communities, and preys on fear. And the only cure is standing up. That doesn't always mean fighting or tackling someone to the pavement. Sometimes it just means asking the right questions, recording the right evidence, and refusing to let lies go unchallenged. Truth, backed by real law, always wins in the end. One evening, weeks after the trial, a neighbor approached me as I was locking up my truck. He was a quiet man, rarely spoke at meetings, always kept to himself. He held out his hand awkwardly. "Chief," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't just protect yourself. You showed all of us we don't have to live scared." I shook his hand firmly. "You never did. You just needed to remember that." The truth is, I wasn't the hero of this story. The community was. I may have stopped the imposters, but it was the neighbors who voted Nancy out, who rebuilt trust, who turned fear into unity. All I did was spark the fire. They kept it burning. That's what justice really looks like, not just punishment, but transformation. So, when people ask me about the HOA incident, I don't tell them about the fight or the trial first. I tell them about the ending: the kids riding bikes, the flags flying, the neighbors who smile at each other without suspicion. Because that's the legacy that matters. Nancy thought she could bend the law. She thought she could twist fear into power. But fear is fragile. It shatters the moment people refuse to believe in it. And that's the story I'll carry with me, not of an HOA president's downfall, but of a neighborhood's rebirth. Justice wasn't just served. It was reclaimed. And for a chief of police, that's the best ending you can ask for.